welcome back, everyone. Well, Canada is going the way of the Netherlands. We have some interesting updates on that today. These same types of policies created in the Netherlands to go after nitrates under the banner of global warming, targeting fertilizers in farms. The Canada is now putting almost the same policies in place, only maybe a bit larger scale. Like what they're doing is actually more encompassing. I'll be explaining this and talking about where that's going. Also, as an update just came in, Ireland is now doing the same thing. And frankly, as we mentioned previously, if it's one country doing it, it's one thing. If it's two countries doing it, fine. If it's like all around the world, you start wondering if something's at work. And we're going to be talking about this today. Also, as this is happening and people are worried about food, the New York Times is promoting cannibalism. I'll show you the New York Times articles and also what they're talking about. And also, we're going to have a great interview later on. I spoke with Senator Josh Hawley about the allegations around J6, so stick around for that too, folks. It's going to be a great episode today. And speaking of which, if you haven't seen the new J6 documentary, be sure to on Epoch TV. For those of you on YouTube, on Rumble, we can't talk about like a lot of that on YouTube, so we can't even show you the trailer on YouTube without them like deleting our channel or risking it. Remember, folks, they're giving you a free trial for Epoch TV. That's in the description below the video. Come over, join us. It's going to be great stuff. We do, again, a full hour-and-a-half episode, live Q&A, and we also have a lot of content like this one right here that you can only find on Epoch TV. So that said, folks, let's get started for the content. I'm going to go into, first of all, Canada and how Canada right now is following what the Netherlands did on the food restrictions. First of all, now this is Ottawa Sun. I'm going to show you this. It says Trudeau pushes ahead on fertilizer reduction as provinces and farmers cry foul. Provincial agricultural minister and ministers are expressing frustration about the Trudeau government over plans to effectively reduce fertilizer use by Canada's farmers in the name of fighting climate change. The important caveat with this is that while in the Netherlands it's a fertilizer reduction program going after nitrates, in Canada they're using a broader program targeting global warming that in practice would constitute about a 30% reduction in fertilizers. Interestingly, about exactly the same as what's happening in the Netherlands. Now, further in, it says the federal government is looking to impose a requirement to reduce nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizers, saying it is a greenhouse gas contributing to climate change. While the Trudeau government says they want a 30% reduction in emissions, not fertilizer, that's the technical caveat that they're trying to they're trying to use that technicality to say it's not a fertilizer ban. It's a nitrous oxide emission restriction, which constitutes a 30% reduction in emissions targeting fertilizer, meaning a 30% reduction in fertilizer. It's like this play on words they're using to claim that it's not what it is, essentially. So when you see people saying, well, technically, maybe Snopes will say, technically it's not a fertilizer ban, that's actually what they're referring to. It's extremely misleading, but this is, again, where the argument is. Now, it says further in, farm producer groups are saying this is the point that reducing nitrous oxide emissions cannot be done without reducing fertilizer use, and that's the issue. Similar to how in the Netherlands, they're noting that you can't reduce fertilizer use, or you can't reduce nitrates. Sorry, theirs is more targeting cows. Theirs is more targeting cows. You can't reduce nitrates without basically closing farms because of the profit margins being so thin that doing that basically means just farms going out of business. That's what it would actually look like in practice. It says here, several provincial governments and organizations representing farmers have asked for emission reductions from fertilizer to be measured via intensity, how much food is produced compared to the amount of fertilizer used. The Trudeau government is demanding an absolute reduction in emissions, which farmers say will result in less food being produced at a time when the world can ill afford it. Remember, in Africa, many countries, you are already having starvation. There is already, from a lot of the cuts and so on, already starvation in parts of Africa. And it's going to get worse, as even the UN is acknowledging. The United Nations itself is saying mass starvation. Now, further in, it says this. Farm groups like the Western Canadian wheat growers have said that the federal plan will reduce crop output, reduce income for farm families, and increase food prices in Canadian grocery stores. Another story here it's the governments in Saskatchewan. It says governments of Saskatchewan, Alberta disappointed in federal target for fertilizer emission reduction. And it says that these ministers of agriculture in both areas are expressing profound disappointment at the federal government fertilizer emissions reduction target. Fertilizer emissions reduction was not even a topic on the agenda of the annual meeting for the federal, provincial, territorial ministers of agriculture, who just finished a 3-day meeting in Saskatchewan. Provinces pushed the federal government to discuss this important topic, but were disappointed to learn that the target is already set, meaning they bypassed them. The commitment to future consultation are only to determine how to meet the target that Prime Minister Trudeau and Minister Bibeau have already unilaterally imposed on this industry. So they bypassed these guys. They just went ahead and did it. They didn't have the option. They're very unhappy that these, again, provincial ministers couldn't do anything about it. And again, they did not consult them on whether this was even achievable or attainable, it's saying. It says Western Canadian farmers already produce the most sustainable agri-food products in the world, and they're continually being asked to do more with less. We cannot feed the growing world population with a reduction in fertilizer. Western Canadian producers base fertilizer inputs on realistic targets based on moisture availability. Producers are conservative in the use of fertilizer inputs and don't add more than what is needed because it's expensive. And also because they know how the soil works. You have to adjust it based on the soil, right? They alone simply can't shoulder the impact of this short-sighted policy. Now, briefly on that, remember we recently had the interview with this individual who is a USDA soil scientist. And he was noting that when you apply fertilizer to soil, there's a couple things you have to know. One, you can't just immediately go from, for example, chemical fertilizers to organic fertilizers like they did in Sri Lanka, without facing the outcome that places like Sri Lanka faced, where you have massive crop failures and where you have essentially just lower food output and people facing starvation. You can't do that in areas especially where the soil is accustomed to having chemical fertilizer, because the soil health begins to go down. And in jungle type climates like Sri Lanka or they have other areas too. If you were to do that, you do have some soil health. It can kind of take it. If you were to do that in the Midwest or areas where they've been using chemical fertilizers for a very long time, and the soil is basically used to that, and then you switch a 180, you're going to have dust bowls, as, again, the soil scientist said on our show just recently. In other words, you can't just do that. Now, in addition to just immediate transition to different types of fertilizers like this, the other issue you're facing is that, as they mentioned, you have to take into account moisture, other things, and you adjust the fertilizer based on the climate, based on temperatures, based on many other factors. If you were to just go ahead and say blanket, standardized from the top, this is how it has to be done, you don't take these minute factors into account. And when you don't take these minute factors into account, that's when you start having crop failures and other issues. This tends to be one of the problems you have with communist type policies in general, or socialist type policies in general, where you want to dictate from the top without taking into account the nuances that do exist on the grassroots level. Now, further on this, they're talking about whether Canada is going to see a food shortage because of this. Farmers Forum is saying this. They're saying, does Ottawa want a food shortage? Federal government wants to cut nitrogen fertilizer by 30%, but that will reduce food supply, the farm group is saying. It says the federal government in Canada, of course, has proposed cutting from farm nitrogen fertilizer usage 30% by 2030, but says reductions on farmland will be voluntary. That's raising eyebrows. Curtailing fertilizer usage, they're saying further in, by even 20% could cost Canadian grain and oilseed growers nearly $48 billion with a B in lost sales because of lower yields over the next 8 years, according to a study commissioned by Fertilizer Canada last year. The new Agriculture and Agri-Food Discussion paper repeats the assertion that Canadian agriculture emits 10% of the country's greenhouse gases. Nitrogen fertilizer is said to contribute by off-gassing nitrous oxide, which the paper claims is up to 298 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, which is why they're targeting it. The Trudeau Liberals have been talking about fertilizer cuts since December 2020. Interestingly, when a lot of these discussions began globally, ironically, when we were really in the heart of the pandemic still, or pandemic policies, I should say still. As part of the government's pledge to radically reduce emissions below 2005 levels by 2030. The pledged overall greenhouse gas reduction was already a whopping 30% before Trudeau upped it to 45% last fall's COP24 conference with no consultation, Barlow pointed out. Remember, COP24, that was the UN conference that groups like the World, we did a whole episode on this, I won't go over it again, but COP24, this seems to be the kind of launch pad for a lot of these programs, including in the Netherlands, including in other places, including even Bill Gates involved with some of this. COP24 was that major conference where the programs we're seeing right now in Netherlands, for example, really started taking off. And following COP24 was when the Netherlands, for example, made a deal with the World Economic Forum to lead the World Food Hub program. Remember, I won't go over it too much, but we did a whole episode on this. If you want to watch it, check it out. Now, remember, the World Food Hubs is essentially the World Economic Forum program to meet the Agenda 2030 program of the United Nations, which includes the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs they call them. There are 17 of which, number 2 being the one about food. So basically what this is saying, boiling that down, is it appears Canada is basing this policy on that same meeting that Netherlands is. The same meeting, the same policies, and the same basic ideas. That's what they're following. And remember, too, the Netherlands is the pilot program of the World Food Hubs, and the World Economic Forum has assigned to the Netherlands what they call this global secretariat, using ironically a communist term for it, to manage that program with them. Now, further into this, it says real agriculture, this is 2021, 1 year after all of that we just discussed, right? 1 year after the COP 2024, it might have been 2019, I can't remember off the top of my head now. But in 2021, Real Agriculture was saying this. They said regulated fertilizer reduction would cost Canadian farmers $48 billion by 2030. And this is the report that previous article is citing. I want to show you a bit of what this report actually says, though. The one we just discussed, this is what they're pointing to. And it says, Fertilizer Canada has released details of a report compiled by Myers Norris Penny that aims to outline the significant impact a regulated reduction in nitrogen fertilizer would have on farmers' bottom lines. The Government of Canada has announced an aspirational goal of 30% absolute emission reduction target for on-farm fertilizer use by the year 2030, while the government has not announced that the reduction will be achieved through regulatory restrictions on fertilizer use. MNP's report explores what the potential outcomes would be on the farm economy if it did. Karen Proud, President and CEO of Fertilizer Canada, explains that MNP used European regulations. Remember, the European Commission was doing this previously, which led to the protests in Germany, which is one of the reasons why German farmers are joining with the Netherlands farmers. The European Commission, previously already in place before we started even talking about this topic, had already started moving on this. The European Commission's is a 20% reduction in fertilizer use that is used to achieve a 30% reduction in emissions, they're claiming. It continues in further, as the basis for a model on how Canadian rules work, the result is a staggering total income loss of $48 billion by 2030, by the time they achieve this, and a significant shift in how much product Canada would have available to fulfill its domestic needs or sell on the international marketplace. Now, remember, too, that a lot of farmers live paycheck to paycheck, or they live season to season, is maybe a better way to put it. In the United States, for example, they usually have to take out loans to purchase seeds, to purchase fertilizer, to purchase other things. They typically run almost on debt. It's not a very lucrative industry, which is why even aside from all of this, the other issue that's kind of looming ahead in the future is the fact that people just don't want to be farmers anymore. A lot of farmers, it's generational, and a lot of the younger generations don't want to do it. That is the other issue, which is a whole other topic. But further in on this, and then if you start cutting their profit margins even more, this is what it's talking about, it makes that even less attractive, meaning basically who's going to do it and what incentive do they have to continue doing it if that tiny margin becomes even slimmer. Now, it notes that many Canadians are very unhappy about this, understandably. And basically, right now, one of the big questions is, will we see protests in Canada like we're seeing in Europe? Remember, it started off in the Netherlands. And it's interesting because I was talking to some friends, Dutch friends from the Netherlands, and they're saying that people in the Netherlands, the Dutch, they tend to be very good at negotiating. It's one of the historical skills Dutch people have. They're very good negotiators. And my friends were saying that, really you can expect them to go to the negotiating table pretty quick. They did not personally believe that given what's happening, when this was first starting in the Netherlands, that it would not last that long. They were saying maybe it'll be a week before people negotiate. We saw that not happen. We actually saw things spiral out of control very quickly. There was the incident, for example, where one of the farmers protesting drove past the police, and the police actually fired their guns at that protester. And in Europe, that's a big deal. You don't normally have stuff like that happen. Now you see protesters from other countries, Germany, Italy, other places, also joining in with them. And basically, in other words, it's spreading. Some of the latest videos include videos of Netherlands farmers overturning police cars, going to the homes of some of the key officials involved with this, putting cow manure in their shredders and just blowing it on their properties. So they're very unhappy, and it doesn't seem like this is going to be a 1 week thing. In fact, we're already long past that. The big question now is, will Canada also see this? And already we do see signs of this. Already it seems that we will be seeing protests similar to the Netherlands in Canada. And a lot of people would point to the trucker protests in Canada, which actually started a movement in the United States as well, where truckers, unhappy about the lockdown policies and the vaccine mandates and other types of COVID-19 policies, held mass protests across Canada. To the extent, if you were to line them up next to each other, they would have stretched the whole length of the country almost. Now remember that Justin Trudeau used laws that may not have, in ways that may not have been legal, that's being debated right now, to make this illegal and to go after even the bank accounts of the truckers who were protesting. But now that this is expanding to another level, the question is, will not only the farmers get involved, but will the truckers as well? Meaning we may see an expansion of those same types of protests. Let me show you Twitter. This is Keen Bext. He's a journalist. He says, it's official. Trudeau's meeting with provincial agriculture ministers wrapped up yesterday. He is moving forward with the 30% fertilizer reduction. Farms will fail. Land will be purchased by billionaires / the government, which a lot of people believe is the agenda, and people will starve. Farmers are rising up today. Let me show you a video. This is Mocha Bezergan of Rebel News. This is a video they have, and it says, more are joining the convoy in solidarity with farmers. The convoy is now merging up with the convoy from Olds as it makes its way towards Edmonton. And so now, again, we see this unfolding as well. In other words, yeah, there you go. So they're laying on their horns, and we won't play that horn, it's okay, it's good. Yeah, they're honking, right? That's the big thing, the honking, and that's their form of protest. Now, the interesting with this is that Ireland is also now following suit. We see this expanding to other countries as well now. Let me show you. Now, those of you curious as well, that today's tea is puer, which is a fermented black tea. It's very, very good. This is in Ireland. and this is the Times report. It says farmers face 28% target on carbon cuts. Ministers poised to impose upper levels on climate change. In other words, it's the same basic policy. This 30% reduction, right, target. And again, you can look place by place. You can look country by country. I've mentioned before, as an investigative reporter, there's two things I look for. I look for patterns and I look for anomalies. And if you want to understand kind of the analysis on understanding where things are going, you look at the trajectory of patterns. Now, when you see an anomaly, it's something unusual, something out of place. And typically when you're working with bureaucracies, whether it's government bureaucracy or corporate bureaucracy, things typically don't go outside of normal bureaucratic practice unless someone makes it go outside of that. And so when you see policies start to change, there's of course an intention behind it. With politics, it's a bit easier because typically they have to go through a process of creating those policies. You know what they're doing. But when you start seeing patterns, you see other people replicating those programs. You see other countries or other companies sometimes spontaneously, it seems, doing the exact same thing. You can typically understand there might be something behind them pushing for that. Now, of course, that type of analysis is what we went through in a recent episode I mentioned, talking about the World Economic Forum basically pushing a lot of these policies. And the World Economic Forum partnered with the Agenda 2030 of the United Nations to carry that out on the business side. It does seem to be the case that all these countries are following these guidelines from that whole system. Ireland is next. It says a carbon reduction target of 27 or 28% is expected to be agreed this week by Eamon Ryan, the Green Party leader, and Charlie McConaughey. It says that who's the agriculture minister, according to government sources. The compromise would be closer to upper end of the 22 to 30% range that was set for the agriculture sector in the Climate Action Plan last year. Government sources say McConaughey is the McConaughey is still resisting pressure to accept the 30% reduction target. And 30% is, again, the number that everyone, Netherlands, Canada, are also implementing. The 30% reduction target amid fears that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael backbenchers could join the farmers' lobby group and opposition parties in resisting it. So again, squeezed from two sides. On one side, you do have the push for these types of policies. On the other side, you do have the farmers and protesters and others basically saying, not on my watch, this isn't going to be happening. But again, this is spreading. That's the important thing. This is spreading right now. And also, quick update too, we had a recent episode talking about Panama and how there are mass protests in Panama. Those are quickly spiraling out of control. In fact, I believe the same day we had on our local there talking with us about what's happening on the ground in Panama last week, mass protests started, which actually started turning violent. And people, for example, hijacking police cars, destroying police cars, setting fires. They look almost like the BLM riots in the United States. And even police running from protesters, police firing at protesters. There are some pretty gory images I won't show you all of some of the wounds from those attacks. It's not clear whether they're live munitions or rubber bullets, but the wounds do appear to be pretty serious in many cases. Anyways, this is spiraling out of control, and as we mentioned in the recent episode last week as well on the note of Panama, even according to a lot of these globalist groups, they believe that not just what they're doing is going to have maybe a cascading effect, but that these failed state situations like Canada, like Sri Lanka, sorry, not like Panama, maybe Canada, like Panama, like Sri Lanka, that's also going to be something we're going to see expanding. And they're acknowledging as well what I've been talking about for a while, which is as you have starvation, particularly in Latin America and in Africa, you're going to see mass migration into Europe and into the United States. And again, the question is that the intent, right? Is that what they're doing intentionally? Now, as this is happening, the New York Times is proposing a solution, that being cannibalism. I'm actually not joking. The New York Times is saying a taste for cannibalism, a spate of recent stomach-churning books, TV shows, and films suggest we've never looked so delicious to one another. And I'm not joking. This is actually what they're saying. Folks, for that, we will jump over to Epoch TV, though. But I want to show you some footage as well of Panama also. We're going to jump over to Epoch TV first, though. Folks, be sure to check out the documentary we just published last week as well. The real story of January 6th. We can't show you the trailer on YouTube, unfortunately, but jump into the description below the video, grab your free trial, and go watch it. Even if you don't want to stick around, watch it. Maybe you'll change your mind, but let us know what you think. All right, that said, I'm going to show you a quick trailer. We had a great interview also with Dr. Robert Malone on people talk about V-AIDS, vaccine AIDS, or being immunocompromised. He actually has some interesting scientific research. There's many papers on this about what's possibly causing this. It's called immune imprinting. Let me show this trailer, and we'll jump over.
There's this training of your immune system to just focus on one thing and exclude everything else. And then there actually is also evidence of damage, more systemic damage to your immune system with this vaccine technology.
What is immune imprinting?
Immune imprinting has long been known in vaccinology. It's one of the things that generally we're not allowed to talk about as vaccinology. The question is, why are these people that have had these repeated vaccinations the ones that are getting the more severe infections, disease, and death? It's a paradox. You would think that they would be protected. That's certainly what we've been told by the U.S. government, and it's still emerging. But the literature on immune imprinting is bomb-proof.
All right. I actually looked at the documents he cites on the two. This is credible, and it's pretty concerning stuff. That said, folks, come join us on Epoch TV. We're jumping over now. All right. Well, on the note of food crisis, on the note of starvation throughout Africa and possibly Latin America, well, New York Times again is proposing a